Hello everyone, my name is John, I'm the Geeky Fanboy, and welcome back to me talking about books. And today we're finally doing a bit of a reading catch-up. I'm going to tell you about some recent reads, so some of the recent books I have read, because I think the last time we did like a monthly reading wrap-up was like back in April or May or something, and it's been a while since then. So today I'm going to just update you on some of the books I've read that I just want to talk about a bit. In the beginning, I'm just gonna quickly mention some books I've read recently, but I've already spoken about here on the channel, just so you know that those are recent reads. And then we're gonna dive into some reading highlights. Those are not all the books I've read recently, but most of them. Just some books I wanna highlight and talk about. I'm gonna stay as spoiler-free as possible. And with that out of the way, let's jump into it. So quickly here at the beginning, just a couple of recent reads that I have covered here on the channel in other videos. So recently I finished a couple of books and mangas and comics on asexuality. I finished Ace by Angela Chang, which was quite interesting. This was a non-fiction book all about asexuality based on different asexual identities all over the spectrum. Was quite interesting, learned a lot about my own sexuality there. And in combination with that, I also read the manga Is Love the Answer, which was a very sweet coming of age, coming out manga about a young, as it turns out, arrow ace girl who is going to university and learns a bit about herself. So I talked about some of those ace books in a video I did during Pride Month. I will link the video up here and down there, so go and check that out. Then, of course, there have been the books that I read for you to do some big analyses on. There was Red Rising, obviously, which was a book that drove me insane. Go and watch the video where I think I talk about for the book about, I don't know, 3 hours or something. Go check that out in case you want to know why I didn't like this beloved dystopian sci-fi classic. And of course, the most recent book I read for the channel was Yellow Face, which was an interesting lit fic novel that I did enjoy but had some issues with, so make sure you check out that review as well. And with that, we're jumping into some other recent reads that I haven't spoken about yet, or only spoke about briefly on the channel. The first one I would like to talk about is a book I have briefly mentioned in a previous video where I talked about the best books I've ever read according to Goodreads, and this was actually on the list, namely The 100 Years' War on Palestine, a history of settler colonial conquest and resistance. Now, I picked up this book because of very obvious current political events, and I have to admit that when this whole topic came to the forefront within the media, obviously it's been going on for a much longer time than that, I didn't really know anything about the history of Palestine, the history of Israel, the history of the conflict between those two countries. I knew absolutely nothing, absolutely nothing. And my girlfriend actually got me interested in the history and the conflict. I really wanted to gain a better understanding of the historical background and the cultural background of Palestine. So I did some research, trying to figure out which book I should pick up, which is usually I regarded from a Palestinian point of view. And I found this one. They also had it at my local bookshop, so I picked up this book. Now, this book looks relatively short. However, the printing is quite small. It's quite densely written, literally and figuratively. It's not even 300 pages long. A lot of these are also just notes on the text, all of these last couple of pages, those are all notes and annotations. So this book basically covers the history of the conflict relationship between the Palestinian people and the Israeli people since the late 19th century and early 20th century, basically since Zionism became a really, really big thing, and how it has impacted Palestinian people and their history and their development. So this basically highlights several important political and military conflicts that have occurred within the history of Palestine, most of which were obviously related to Israel as well. But it starts out in like the late 19th century, early 20th century. Like the first chapter is the first declaration of war, 1917, and we get a bit of like prehistory, early 20th century, like the what the British Empire did when they were there, and all of that. So we get a bit of preamble on that, and then starts sort of from there with the First World War and all of that. So it covers the first declaration of war, which was sort of around First World War, around that time. Then the second declaration of war is around shortly after Second World War. It's 1947-48. Then the third declaration of war is 1967, the fourth declaration of war 1982, the fifth one is 1987 till 1995, and the sixth declaration is 2000 to 2014, and then we have a conclusion. So this book was written before the current events. I think this book came out in 2020. Nevertheless, I think it highlights the most important events that you sort of need to know to have background knowledge. Now, this is very densely written. I had virtually, like I said, no knowledge on the history, and so it was a bit hard to understand some aspects that were talked about here, because the author throws in a lot of names, like many names, many dates, just like walls and walls of information, historical context, cultural context. So it is sometimes a bit hard to fully grasp the entire picture of what the author wants to tell you. You can't really read this like back to back. Like I had to take some breaks in between sometimes to just sort of like cope with what I've read, to like sort of look up some stuff maybe on the internet to like sort of contextualize some of the stuff I read. But nevertheless, this is very interesting and very important to read. Like if, like me, you didn't have any previous knowledge and you sort of want to familiarize yourself with the issue, check out this book. Like this is also written from a Palestinian point of view. It's also written by someone who has or had family in Palestine, who people who have known other people who have gone through various different aspects of these wars or conflicts. So we get a lot of like different viewpoints as well, but naturally with the focus of on the Palestinian people, the Palestinian history, the Palestinian culture. And you really get a great picture of that this whole thing is so much more complicated than you might think, but that it also is to a certain degree a lot simpler than you think. Like as someone who didn't really know why there was conflict between Palestine and Israel, this book pretty early on points out this is Zionism and this is what the problem is with this movement, if you can call it that. I don't know. And pretty early on, the book lays like the sort of ground foundation, showing you where the base problems basically began, even though of course there are multiple problems there. Obviously I'm not an expert. This is why I'm telling you to read this book, because it was really interesting, and I really felt like I gained a greater understanding of the culture, of the history. Like, it really got me interested in the history of this country and the history of the people. And it really felt like I learned something. Like I've read something important. That's what this felt like. Now, again, this wasn't a perfect read. I think I gave this like 4 out of 5 because it is a bit difficult to read, especially if, like me, you don't have any previous knowledge at all. It is very densely written. A lot of information is thrown at you on every page. It's hard to sometimes keep track of all the names of all the dates. I mean, you don't necessarily have to, but it helps. So it was a little hard to sometimes understand some things, but nevertheless, I think this is a good read if, like me, you want a greater understanding of the Palestinian-Israel conflict, on what Zionism is, on what this whole history of this country is. So this is honestly a really good and also important read. And if you in any way care about the history of Palestine, if you care about the Palestinian people, if you care about what's happening to them right now, which is just an awful, awful thing that we're observing here, go check out this book and learn something. Now, as a quick diversion from that, which is a bit of a nicer topic, I guess, during Pride Month, I read a DC Pride collection, an older one from 2021, I had my eye on the DC Pride collections for a while, but I never got my hands on them. Then they had one at my local comic book shop. So I picked the one up from 2021. I also picked up a new one quite recently. I'm not quite sure which one I actually picked up. But yeah, I read the one for 2021 during Pride Month, and that was a really fun Pride Month read as someone who's like, interested in DC comics and comics in general, and who's always looking out for like queer representation. This was a really fun read. It's basically a compilation of different short stories of various queer characters within the DC canon. Some of those stories are a bit more interesting, some of them are not as interesting, some of them a bit more quirky, some of them are a bit more serious. So I think it's a good mix. None of them like are super great, like none of them did like massively stand out to me, but none of them also were terribly bad. I thought it was a good mix of actually really cool, and some of them were like okay, kind of forgettable. But nevertheless, I think this is a fun read if like me, you're a comic book fan, if you're a DC fan and just on the lookout for some queer representation, that's a good read. Now, also during Pride Month, I think, or shortly after, I read another queer book, a relatively new one. I read Infinity Alchemist by Kaysen Calendar. Is that how you pronounce their name? I hope that's how you pronounce their name. I'm sorry if it's not. So, I picked this one up at a, actually earlier this year at my local book fair. So we have like a big book fair and comic con here, and this was one of the books I bought there because first off, I love the covers. It looks really cool, and the premise actually sounded quite interesting. So this is actually YA fantasy, and yes, I do actually try to read YA fantasy to see if there's some stuff I like there. And this is a YA fantasy book about a young trans boy called Ash, and he grows up in a world where alchemy is a kind of magic that is practiced. However, not everyone is privileged to learn about alchemy. So he's someone who wants to learn about alchemy, but unfortunately is not privileged enough to join the school, to join the classes where they teach people about the different types of alchemy. He works at the school, but he's not really officially allowed to learn about it. Nevertheless, he, of course, tries to learn some alchemy despite all that, and sort of performs it by himself in secret, which gets him into trouble and gets him into contact with one Ramsay Thorn. Ramsay Thorn is a gender fluid character. They switch between male presenting and female presenting almost on a chapter by chapter basis, which was quite cool. Also pronoun change, so sometimes they go by he, sometimes they go by she. So that's quite cool. And they sort of form a bond, and Ramsay, who's a really young professor, like just 1 or 2 years older than Ash, they form a bond, and Ramsay promises to keep his secret that Ash tried to learn alchemy if Ash helps him to find a legendary MacGuffin, essentially. So this book, I thought, had a really interesting premise. I love the queer representation, which was also a major reason why I picked it up, because like trans boy protag and gender fluid protag are really cool. Also the promise, which I knew of, a love triangle that's actually being resolved via polyamory. So I was looking forward to that as well. But this was still really disappointing. Basically, the one big thing I really, really liked about this book was the queer representation. So what I liked about this is that the queerness of the characters is never put into question in this world. So our main guy is a young trans boy, or young trans man. He's like 17, I think around 16, 17, 18 years old. And his transness is just there. It's never questioned, it's never addressed. It's not like a source of like major like trauma or embarrassment for him. He doesn't constantly mention it. He only really mentions it a couple of times when it becomes necessary in that particular moment or in that particular dialogue. But other than that, it's never really an issue. We're made aware of it, and then it's just there. It's just the thing we know about the protagonist. But there's other stuff he's got going on. And the same basically goes for Ramsay. Like their gender fluidity, it's just something that's there. Like it's sort of explained how that works, but it's not presented as something weird. It's not presented as anything unusual that people find outrageous. It's just a thing that's there, and everyone deals with it basically, and everyone just like sort of adjusts accordingly depending on how Ramsay is outwardly presenting in that particular chapter. And we also get a third character later who basically fulfills this whole love triangle polyamory thing. And the polyamory in this is also not really questioned. Like it's questioned in the way of, oh, can three people really be in love? Can two people be? Can you love two people at once? Like sort of that. But then it's mostly like resolved, and they are a throuple. And it's not a source of like embarrassment or weirdness. So that's something I really, really liked. That the queerness was just there. And it wasn't really questioned. It only came up when it was really important to the characters in that moment. But it wasn't like any big thing that was like standing out in this world. The rest of the book was very underwhelming, mediocre. Like basically this leans a bit too much into romantasy, I guess. Like it's not quite full on romantasy like some other stuff as I've read on the channel, but it also very heavily leans into the romantic relationships between the main characters a little too hard, and basically forgets about the entire main plot with like the magic MacGuffin book and all that, and how to learn alchemy and all of that. Like it really felt like the plot was dragging on and on and on. I was just waiting for them to like go and do something, to go and engage with the plot. I was like, hey, aren't you like trying to figure out what's going on with the magic book? What's going on with the MacGuffin? No, we're just like spending time with these characters falling weirdly in love after a short time. Okay, and then that just sort of happens again in the second half of the book with the third character of the throuple. And like there's no story in here where I was really like latching on to what was going on, because barely anything really happened. Just like sort of meandered around, and then at the end it's like sort of wrapped up, but you don't really actually know what happened, and it's very anticlimactic. Then you're like, okay, yeah, that happened. I think there's a second book supposed to be coming out, which I didn't know when I bought this book. I also think this book is relatively new, so I think when I bought it, maybe the sequel hadn't been announced yet. I also think the magic in this book could have been explained a bit more, because alchemy, I think, is a cool concept. Alchemy is interesting, and it's sort of teased that, you know, that there's the school and there are different like not quite castes, but like houses within the country they live in, or like within the school. I don't even quite remember, because it's not really that important to make clear. And they're like different houses that like value different things, or like do different things with their alchemy, but it's not really focused on. Also because our main character is not a student at the school. He's not allowed to really learn all those things. So we don't really learn anything about the country, about the school, about the culture of these different houses. We don't really learn anything about that. So this is much more focused on, you know, hanging out with these characters as they fall in love, which, you know, is okay if that's what this book is supposed to be. But, you know, from the blurb on the back, I kind of thought, oh, this is going to be mostly like, you know, a YA fantasy with like romance side plot. And it's not really that. So at the end, I gave this book 2.75 stars. It left me disappointed. I did love the queer representation. For that, it's really, really great. If you're like on the lookout for YA fantasy with great queer representation, it's got that going for it. And I mean, if you don't mind the sort of like boring, lackluster story, I mean, you could give this a read if you want. However, I was unfortunately disappointed by this. Now, the second book I picked up together with the Infinity Alchemist at that book fair, Comic-Con, was this book, Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. Now, I had wanted to read something about Octavia E. Butler forever. Like, she's just a name you know, right? So I saw this book and was like, oh, yeah, I've wanted to read something by her for ages. So let's give this one a try. This is an older book. I think it came out in the early 90s. And the blurb on the back of the book sounded quite interesting because this is set, which was at the time a futuristic, apocalyptic world. Actually, this is set during 2024, so this was kind of weird to read in 2024. So this is set in like a sort of dystopian world. I think it's North America, and food is scarce, water is scarce, there's gangs, there's a lot of crime, especially also against women. Generally things are like pretty tough. And we get to know this young woman called Lauren, and she has a power which basically makes her feel emotions real strong. So she feels emotions really heavily, especially in relation to others. So if others have a strong feeling, she can or she will feel that as well. So that's sort of her power. And we sort of get to know her, we get to know her life in that little like village that she has with her family, and then the story sort of moves on from there as she grows up, and then one day leaves that town and travels across the country and meets a bunch of other people. And while she travels, she philosophizes about their country and about her power and about her own religion that she's sort of coming up with as they go on that journey. So I thought the premise of this sounded quite interesting, but then I was a little, I'm not sure if disappointed is the right word. I think I wrote in my Goodreads review that this is more of a case of it's not you, it's me. I think I just didn't quite get this book. So I gave this book 3.25 stars, I think, which means it's not bad. It's okay. Like, you can give it a read. It's just, I think it's not, maybe just not my thing, or maybe I just didn't get it. Like, maybe I was just expecting more of a like proper linear story and like a really like deeper focus on Lauren's emotion power. But this book doesn't have like one coherent storyline, for like almost half of the book, because it's mostly like in the beginning like just chapters of Lauren's life, like how she grew up with her families, like what happened to her family as she grew up, what happened to her, and what eventually leads her to leaving that little town she lives in, that little village. And then it sort of becomes a bit more coherent from there. She travels across the country and picks up a bunch of different people, but it still has a very like episodic feeling. And I'm just someone who usually needs a bit of a red thread and something where I can see, okay, this is where we start and this is where we're going, and we could go from there to there. Again, that's more of a me thing. And what I was sort of missing was that I really hoped this book would dive more into Lauren's like power, this weird supernatural emotion feeling that she has, and her reflection on that. But the book wasn't really about that. Like, this book is much more concerned with Lauren's like philosophical ideas, with her religious ideas. Like, she has this entire basically like religion that she comes up with throughout the book, and she tells people about, and that she writes about. So it's a lot more like reflections on that, like reflections on beliefs. And that was just something I didn't really expect to get from this book. Like, again, it's more of I wasn't just really into that as I was reading it. I can totally see why people would love this book. I think there are interesting aspects to it. I think it just wasn't for me. Like, I just, again, I didn't hate this. I just was maybe just expecting something else. So maybe if there's someone out there who's read this book and really likes it, maybe like tell me why you like it. I would love to know, because I just had a bit of trouble with it. And I think that's more of a me thing. So I think if you still think this sounds interesting and the premise sounds intriguing to you, I would still think that you should give this a go. Now, next up, I want to highlight another comic book. Namely, I want to highlight The Riddler Year 1. Now, this is a tie-in comic book to the Robert Pattinson Batman movie, a movie I recently rewatched because it's so good. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's literally one of the best comic book movies ever, and just genuinely a really, really, really good movie. And then I got the comic book that is about the Riddler, because the Riddler is the bad guy in that Batman movie. And if you didn't know, the Riddler is, apart from the Joker, my favorite Batman villain. So of course I was curious to get into this one. And this comic book basically chronicled the origin of the Riddler as we see him in the movie, like what happens to him before he becomes that person. Like we see a bit of his childhood, like in some flashbacks, and then we just see his sort of day-to-day life, like his office job, what he does there, people he works for, and of course his mental struggles, his struggles with mental illness, with all kinds of like paranoia, depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, like all that. And we just see him, how he begins to spiral and how he eventually becomes the person we know as the Riddler in the movie, who then goes on to do what he does. And I thought this book was really, really interesting. The art in this was really gritty, dark, gruesome, like really like washed out in certain places. Like it looks purposefully very like harsh, where you can't always tell what's actually going on. It looks purposefully chaotic, it looks purposefully dark and depressing, like very much reflects the perception the Riddler, Edward Nashton, has of the outside world, but the perception he also has of himself, since he has very low self-esteem. And there's all kinds of trigger warning for this book in regards to mental illness, and he has a lot of shit going on. And I think this comic book manages to like really get you in the mind of this version of the Riddler, makes you understand how he takes what he's going through, why he is the way he is, how he comes to idolize Batman, how he comes to hate Bruce Wayne and the Waynes in general, why he despises Gotham and its politicians and police force and all that. And you really get a good idea for the character, I think, in this book. Now, the only like troubles I have with this is that some of these sentiments get repeated a bit too often. Like many of these sentiments in this series are repeated over and over and over again. You just sort of get it. Like I know that this is a repeating curse if you have mental illness, that you just have the same awful thoughts all the time. But for a reading experience, this was sometimes a little annoying, where I was like, okay, yeah, this is the same sentence, the same sentiment, same sentence, same phrase we read in the last issue 5 times. So yeah, I get it. Like that was sort of just like a bit too much of repetition of the same story beats, of the same character beats at certain points, and it felt like it was just sort of like going in circles a little bit. I wanted the story to move on to something else so we could explore other parts of the Riddler psyche. I know there's also one chapter in this, which is one of the later issues, which is essentially an entire issue written as if it was an excerpt from the Riddler scrapbook, essentially. And some people really didn't like that, I know, because it's not really comic book paneling, like classic comic book paneling, but it's really presented as you're reading the Riddler's scrapbook. Like you're reading his thoughts, you're reading his diary entries, his little scribblings, his little photographs and all that. So it's not a classic comic book issue per se, but I personally thought it was really, really interesting, because in this sort of longer series, I don't mind having one issue that's a bit different. It's maybe not classic comic bookish, and I think for this type of character, for this type of series, which really goes into the psyche, into the mind of a character, it's really interesting to just have this excerpt of this very personal piece of like information that we have on this character, that we have on Edward Nashton. So I thought that was actually a really, really interesting issue to read. So overall, I would say this was a really cool comic book to read. Like if you like the movie, or if you're like just a fan of the Riddler, of the character, I think this is a really interesting comic book to get into. Again, maybe look up some trigger warnings for this one. The art, I thought personally, was really cool, dark and gritty, but might not be for everyone. There are some story beats that drag out a bit or repeat a bit too often, but overall I had good fun with this, and I think I gave it 4 stars. So as a comic book reader, I can recommend this one. And obviously this wouldn't be a recent read if I didn't talk a bit about Avatar: The Last Airbender. Like, you see this book behind me, like, I know it's a German edition, but this is the Avatar: Last Airbender official art book, actually. And I finally read it. I know I've had it around for a while now behind me, but I hadn't actually read it. But now I did. A couple of weeks ago, I finally read it. I'm going to put up some pictures here if I can while I'm talking, because this art book is really cool. Like, if you're a fan of the show, definitely check it out if you can. Like, you see a bunch of like different behind the scenes art, how the characters were conceptualized, how the entire show was conceptualized, from where it started to what it eventually became. It was really interesting to see to sort of see the differences of development of what this was originally supposed to be, and then how they like sort of moved a bit away from that, and then how they eventually developed the pilot, which was really cool to see, because I'd never really seen stuff from the pilot. I knew that it exists, but I'd never really seen anything from it. And then I always love concept art. I just love concept art for animated things, like be it for shows, movies, video games. I just love concept art. And the art for this show is just really, really great, especially like the sort of background paintings. They're all really, really gorgeous. And all of these drawings and paintings, they're all accompanied by pieces of information from the 2 writers of the show, who like give insight on how they came up with the design, what their inspiration was for it, how they maybe changed some stuff because of how animation works. So that was really, really cool. I can honestly recommend this book to any fan of the show. And combined with that, I also read another Avatar: Last Airbender comic book, because I mentioned it, I'm trying to finally read all the novels and all the comic books, and I've recently read The Rift, which I think is the third comic book in the Last Airbender series. I've enjoyed the comic books based on the show a lot. The third one, while not as good as the first two, I still enjoyed. It has a similar theme to what we see in the Northern Air Temple episode. So it's very much focused on Aang being stuck like in his mentality of, this is airbending tradition, this is what we're doing, this is what should be preserved. And opposite that, we have represented by Toph this time. We have industrial revolution, essentially, the future, becoming more futuristic, becoming more engineered, moving on, developing things. And these 2 mentalities and these 2 characters essentially clash in this story, as they both land in a little village, which used to be a big spiritual spot for the air nomads. And now there's just like a city with a big like a big city, like where stuff is being built and developed, and Aang is like, oh, it really shouldn't look like that. Like, this is a really important and spiritual place for airbender culture. And Toph is like, hey, we got to move on with history. Like, you and your people weren't here for many, many years, and the people that lived here have moved on, and now things are like that. So those are sort of like the 2 sentiments that are going on this book. We also get some people from Toph's past. I don't want to hint at who, but we get some of Toph's past who reappears here, which was quite interesting to see for Toph's character development. And we also get a bit of background on Aang and airbender culture and air nomad history. Also a little bit of background on Yang Chen. If you like her as an avatar, this is a good comic book to check out. So yeah, I had fun with this comic book. Again, not as good as the first 2, but still very interesting. It's just fun to hang out with these characters. I think the comic books are a great way to keep the story going. So in case you haven't checked out the comic books yet, go and do that. They're pretty good. And then moving on to another animated property I like. Well, it's a video game. We're moving on to Cyberpunk 2077 and this novel, Cyberpunk 2077, no coincidence. So a couple of months ago, I finally picked up the video game, which I've wanted to do for a long time. Now finally picked it up, and it's now my favorite video game of all time. Yeah. if you thought, oh boy, this game is bad because it had a really bad start, yes, it did. Yes, it had a horrible release, but have you checked the game out recently? It's bloody brilliant. Like, it's really good. You really should check it out if you can. So I'm really obsessed with the video game, and I'm trying to get my hands on all kind of cyberpunk media now. And one of the first obvious choices was the official book. And I was really excited to get into it. Also because it's a heist story, so this is basically about like a group of different weird people from the cyberpunk universe with all kinds of different backgrounds, and they're all forced to go on a heist. And I love me a good heist. And in a cyberpunk setting, brilliant. Now, if only this book was any good. So I gave this book 2 stars. And I wish I could tell you in detail what this book is really about. But I can't. Because I don't know. I told you it's a heist, but that's all I know. And I couldn't even really tell you how the heist happened, who all of these people are that were involved. I don't know, because this book is written in a very confusing way, meaning this book has a gazillion characters with a gazillion POVs, and those POVs change all the time. Like, I'm gonna try and find a page that represents this well, because, oh boy, this is so confusing to read, because there's a POV change on almost every page. And per chapter, you have, I don't know, at least like 2 or 3 like POV change at a time. Like if you look at this, so this is one POV, right? This is where it stops. This is where a new POV begins. This is where it ends. This is where a new POV begins. Then you flip the page. This is where this POV ends again, and a new one begins, which already ends again here. And this was only like 4 pages. And this was like how many POV changes? I don't know. So it was really confusing to even understand what was going on. Because the story, like a TV show, basically flipped around the whole time. This honestly felt like this was maybe at some point written like a script for a movie or a TV show, where you can have multiple quick edits. But in a book, this doesn't really work, I think. So I didn't really understand what was going on, who these people were. I recognized the main character's name and who they were, but I didn't manage to like have any feelings for them, because the book was like just like switching around all the time. So I didn't really have the time to build a connection, to like form a connection to these characters. And then you get a relatively like surprisingly quick anticlimactic ending. And then you're just left there being like, oh, okay, I guess that's that. I guess that's that. I don't really care what happened to these people. I don't even know what happened to some of these people. So this was honestly really, really disappointing, because the writing style in and of itself isn't bad. Like, it really immerses you into the world of the video game and of the tabletop RPG. Like, it's really got that down. Like, it nails the vibe. You really feel like you are in Night City. Though it also helps if you're already familiar with the world. Like, there's some stuff in here which doesn't get explained, where I'm like, I think you would have trouble understanding that if you haven't played the game or the tabletop RPG. But like it manages to like immerse you in this world, but apart from that, you're like, I don't know what's happening in this world. I honest to God do not know. Like, if there's someone out there who read this book and enjoyed it, please tell me why, and tell me what actually happened. Because I finished this book and then I was like, I have no idea what we just did. And then my most recent finished read is also a very recent book, which has only now been published, like just a couple of days ago. The Life Impossible by Matt Haig. Now, I actually plan on doing a review video on this book alone. So in a couple of days, I will also upload a review for this book, just for this book. Because Matt Haig is one of my absolute favorite contemporary authors of all time. His books mean a lot to me. His books have actually sort of saved my life. at a time where my depression for the first time hit really, really hard. And at that time, I picked up a book by Matt Haig, which was called Reasons to Stay Alive, which was his first nonfiction book where he spoke about his depression. And that really, really helped me at the time. And ever since then, I've read every single one of his books, and also some of his older books. So I was really, really excited to pick up this book, because Matt Haig is a wonderful writer. I know his writing is very emotional, it's kind of cheesy, it's a bit over the top, but that's sort of what I like about him. And he always manages to like touch me emotionally in some way, and almost all his books have made me cry in one way or another. So I was really excited to get into this. And unfortunately, this wasn't quite what I had expected. Now, I'm gonna talk about this a bit more when I do the review video for this. I didn't hate it. I think I gave this 3.5 stars, which means it was all right. It just was very underwhelming to me. So this book is about a 72-year-old retired maths teacher who is a widow and whose son has died a long time ago because of an accident. And she is grieving, she's depressed, and she receives the information of a former colleague of hers, a former teacher colleague of hers, who has died and who has left her a house in Ibiza. And feeling like she doesn't really have anything else to do, she decides to go to Ibiza and live in the house, see what happened to her former colleague, a person she didn't really know all that well, so she's a bit surprised why this house was left to her. And so she starts to unravel the mystery surrounding her former friend and colleague. She gets to know some of the people who knew her, and then eventually she uncovers a supernatural entity which seems to live on the island, and she comes into contact with, and this entity also seems to have something to do with the disappearance of her former colleague. I don't want to say much more here. That's sort of the premise. So in of itself, interesting. Like Matt Haig's books have always had a little bit of like a magical realism, supernatural touch. That wasn't really my issue with this book. I also like that we have an older protagonist in this book, and she's not the only one. There are also other like sort of more senior characters in this, which is something I quite like, because we don't get a lot of books, like popular books with older protagonists. And also, I was looking forward to reading this because I knew this was going to be something very personal for Matt Haig, because if you know a bit about something of Matt Haig, have read maybe some of his other books or some interviews about him, you know that Ibiza is a very special or important place to him, because it was a place he visited when he was struggling with depression for the first time when he was a young man, and it was the place where he almost committed suicide. So this place means a lot to him. So this was quite a personal story for him to tell, which is why I was also looking forward to reading this. But this has left me sort of underwhelmed, because this story starts out really, really interesting with like the 72-year-old woman, and she's depressed and she's grieving and she's like blaming herself for the death of her son and all that. Then she gets to this house and there's apparently like a supernatural entity, and it's all interesting. And then it just the story hits a point where it just sort of stops, and it stops being coherent for a good while. And then it sort of, I think personally, it stops sort of engaging with the main premise, you know, figuring out what happened to the colleague and all that. And I felt like the book was sort of ignoring what it had set up to do, and then went in a completely different direction. And then we also get the introduction of a out of nowhere cliche capitalist supervillain, and it was really confusing. And without saying how it ends, but like the ending then just sort of like happens, like it's not really that big of a thing even, and I was just like, we're done. Oh, okay. Like it was very sort of underwhelming. Like this entire book was underwhelming. I don't know if it was because I was expecting something else. I don't know. I just feel like Matt Haig wasn't really sure if he wanted to do magical realism sort of like a little bit supernatural, or if he really wanted to do proper sci-fi. Because the supernatural elements in this lean very heavily into sci-fi, but not fully. And that was so irritating for me, because the entire time I felt like, okay, this is more than what he usually does, but it's also not full-on sci-fi. So it's like this weird in-between thing where I'm like, okay, this is like, do you want, like, lean into the full sci-fi if you want to do the full sci-fi, like, give me all the sci-fi explanations, but it's not really doing that, but it's also doing more than what I'm used to from his books. So it felt a bit weird. Like, it was halfway here and halfway there, sort of. And I wasn't really sure how to feel about that. And the way in which the story progresses is, like I said, interesting, and then it just sort of hits a point where it slows down, and just sort of never really picks up again. And that was sort of disappointing, because I thought we were going to do one thing, and then the book didn't do that. And it felt like the book didn't do anything. Now I was just sort of left there being like, can we, like, are we gonna, like, engage with that plot? No, we're not gonna engage with, okay, we're just hanging out here for like 100 pages, not really furthering the plot. Okay, yeah, I guess we can do that. I don't know. Like, again, I didn't hate this. It's a 3.5. I didn't hate it. It's just maybe high expectations, because Matt Haig is one of my favorite authors. Again, I'm going to talk about it more in the single review. But if you're a fan of Matt Haig, you probably will like this to some degree. But like me, there might also be just some expectations that won't be met. So maybe turn down those expectations. This book didn't hit as emotionally for me as Matt Haig's books usually do. It felt a bit more all like surface level emotions and all that. So again, I will tell you more in the next video. But for now, this was a 3.5, which doesn't mean it was horrible, but it was also surprisingly underwhelming. Okay, that's it for some recent reads of mine. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have any thoughts and opinions on any of the books that I've talked about here today, put them down in the comments below. I would love to hear some of your opinions on the books I've read. And please do tell me what some of your recent reads were. Like, are there some recent like reading highlights that you really enjoyed, or were there some like real bad flops where you're like, oh God, why did I read that? Do tell me down in the comments below. I would love to hear what some of you guys have all been reading. As always, if you're curious as to know what I'm currently reading, and if you want to get like some little reviews of the books I read, go follow my Goodreads and or Storygraph accounts. Link for those are in the description down below, so you can follow me there. I try to write reviews for almost everything I read, so go follow me there if you're curious as to know what I'm always reading. What I'm currently reading is I'm actually reading another Avatar book at the moment. I'm reading the first Yang Chen novel, which I'm sort of slowly working my way through because it's not as engaging as I had hoped, really. And in a couple of days, I will pick up the next book for you guys for the next popular TikTok book review. And yes, it will be Light Lark by Alex Aster. Thanks, guys. Thanks for voting for that book. So yeah, that's what I'm currently reading. Let me know what you're currently reading if you're up to it in the comments down below. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't done already. And I'll see all of you very soon. Goodbye.